viewers, welcome to this series of lectures on modern European history, and you do well to recall that presently we are covering the timeline which happens to be in between 1815, which was the Congress of Vienna period, up to 1848, and in that we have divided our interactions into several segments, and today's segment is going to be the liberal gains in France from the period 1830 to 1848. I have earlier spoken to you about the liberal gains in France for the period 1815 to 1830, so it would be better if you just treat this particular lecture as something which is in continuum with the one that I just spoke to you about, liberal gains in France from 1815 to 1830. Now, as I told you, as a kind of a primer to what we are going to talk about, and this I have time and again been repeating, that you always have to keep in mind at least three big ideas that were at play all through the 19th century European history, that is liberalism, nationalism and socialism. Socialism, of course, as you'd understand, took some time to take off because of the Industrial Revolution, and its permeation or its spread to different parts of Europe took time. Workers required to be, industrial workers required to be in a critical number in order to espouse the idea of socialism and take it forward as a political force. So, the impact of that can very visibly be seen post the 1848 revolution in France or Europe in general, but there are some, you can say, incipient stage of the building up of that momentum, where the radicals or the lower middle class in social terms, they are increasingly realizing that their fight against the old regime, against the conservative regime, against the traditional regime, against the monarchy, so far was in association with the middle class, with the liberals, and increasingly you will find that they are getting to realize that or it is dawning upon them that their interest is not best served, their class interest is not best served in association with the upper middle class. Not only in France, but even elsewhere you find this kind of a tendency, this kind of a trend in European history. And very soon, in the later half of the 19th century, you find the working class, the industrial working class or the radicals amongst them come to fight for their own. They become a class for themselves in Marxist terms, because Marx has defined class with respect to two parameter, class in itself and class for itself. So, they now realize in ideational terms that their interest would be best served if they fight for themselves and not in association with the upper middle class in France, whose common opposition of course was the monarchy, the traditional order, the aristocratic order and so forth. So, that is something that you have to constantly keep in mind all through this lecture. Alongside that, the idea of nationalism, fight for a republican polity and so forth, that is also espoused by the middle class, and so far up to the middle of the 19th century, be it the lower middle class or the middle class or the upper middle class, they are all together in this, and they are fighting for the creation of a republican nation. But thereafter, you have with the spread of socialist ideas and ideology, there are some very visible signs of cracks in this coming together of various social groups against the traditional order. But let us see how it all unfolds in France in today's lecture. As you can see on your slide, the 1830 revolution, about which I had earlier spoken to you in my previous interaction, we all know that it ended up largely serving the interests of the middle class, and this had left the radicals among them, the lower middle class, high and dry. In fact, Duke of Orleans was called upon to take the throne, to become the king. Louis Philippe, that's the title, that's the name that he got, and he ruled from 1830 to 48 with the promise that he would abide by the Constitution of 1814. Remember, while talking of the Congress of Vienna, I told you that the 1814 revolution in France was to meet the best political needs of the upper middle class, right? There is a conservative streak in 1814 constitution, and the upper middle class wants only this. They don't want the momentum or the movement to become any more radical, right? Whereas, so far as the opposition to monarchical order is concerned, the traditional ancien regime is concerned, the lower middle class or the radicals were together with the middle and upper middle class. Now, obviously, the 1814 constitution had been suiting the liberal needs very well, and so this arrangement post the 1830 revolution also did not satiate the political aspirations of the radicals and the lower middle class in France. In fact, the radical democratic movement in France had Auguste Blanqui as its leading spokesman, and I have earlier spoken to you about Babeuf of the conspiracy of equals fame. During the French Revolution also, his name was evoked, and some kind of a very incipient idea related to redistribution of wealth had been spoken of in his context. So, there is a distinct socialist ideological slant that we get to see in the ideas of Babeuf, although they were only later formalized and organized in the writings of Karl Marx. So, Auguste Blanqui is the one who is leading the radical democratic movement in France, and there is a distinct impact of Babeuf on him. Now, since the political aspirations and ideas that are dear to the lower middle class, the radicals, are also going to be taken care of in this period, and they are to be furthered. So, obviously, they require, and the political arrangement, of course, was not suited for this. So, they adopted the means for articulating their ideas through writings, through pamphlets, or you can largely club them all together through press. And also during this period you will find a lot of secret society activities, which is so typical of the left movement, and also caricatures. So, sarcasm and some cartoons, etc., were also resorted to, particularly related to Louis Philippe and this can be seen in several of such printed documents that we get for the period. And this had tremendously brought down the esteem and prestige of monarchy, and it was reaching to people at large. Please keep in mind, printing press is very much in place, literacy is also increasing. So these are the new ways and means by which such movements are being led forward. By 1834, of course, pushed by or urged by these activities of the radicals, the government declares all radical political organizations as illegal in France, and very soon in 1835 followed the censorship laws. So these are very typical government response which has monarchy in place, although it largely is a constitutional monarchy. Hence, as a result of these gag measures, the movement or democratic republican movement became further radicalized, and a giant protest meeting was scheduled on February the 22nd in 1848, and this is something that we know as or which we know as February Revolution in France. Now, as a consequence of this, or as a part of this, rioting and barricading were resorted to. You have to keep this in mind, that whenever such protest meetings were organized, the imagery that was at the back of these protesters was that of the French Revolution, and some kind of duplication of those methods and means were to be seen in these protests as well. This is something that we get to see again in 1848, right? So that impact, or that lasting impact of the French Revolution is very much there. As a consequence of this, the monarch Louis Philippe had to abdicate, and this further increased the demands for a republic. Remember, 1815, as a consequence of the Congress of Vienna, it was monarchy that was reinstalled in greater part of Europe, France included. Now, as a consequence of this revolution, demand for a republican government and a constitutional government had gained a lot of credence and strength, and therefore, as a consequence of the February Revolution, we find a provisional government in place in France, which was manned by 10 people, and it was established as a provisional government in Paris. Of the 10 men who were manning this government, 7 came from middle of the road republican leaning. So you can say in present parlance, centrists, right? And this included Lamartine, and the rest 3 were largely socialists in outlook, which included Blanc. So this is how this provisional government comes into being, and I just gave you the ideological slant of the people who were manning this government, this provisional government, as a consequence of the February Revolution in 1848. Now, what this revolution does, although there is not much in consequential terms that we can take away from this revolution, nevertheless, in social terms, which is very indicative of the future politics in France, the veneer of solidarity between the middle class republicans and radical socialists that so far was marked by a common hostility with the government of Louis Philippe was removed henceforth. because there's no Louis Philippe now, there's no monarch now to oppose. And so this common opposition to this monarchical system now does not exist. And you can understand this as parting of ways also, like the radicals among the middle class now understood that their movement and their politics is going to be little different from the middle class politics or the upper middle class politics. So it marks the entry of the liberal politics, or you can say radical politics of France entering into a distinct stage, a different stage altogether. Now, Blanc, who is displaying socialist leaning, stood for establishment of national workshops. Now, these national workshops were visualized as cooperatives, where training was to be imparted, and some kind of a stipend for the people who even were unemployed was provided for. So it's a classical socialist kind of model that Blanc stood for, right? And this was the flashpoint. So the politics now, the policies, the economics of the politics would now veer around the idea of workshops. Is it viable, or is it just a drain on the finance of France? So this proves to be the future flashpoint between the radicals and the upper middle class. The government instead established workshops which were programs for public works, and they were all organized around Paris. And this will just give you an idea as to what the situation was in France at this point of time. The government had initially planned of employment for around 10 to 12,000 people in these workhouses or workshops actually, and in real terms came some 120,000 workers. So almost 10 times the envisaged number, 10 times the worked out number actually came. And this can be a very good indicator of the high unemployment that France was undergoing at around this point of time. Paris henceforth becomes the hub of radical writers. You have a provisional government in place, the monarchy is gone, Blanc is very much there in this provisional government. The slant of the politics is obviously socialist now. So Paris becomes the center of the radical writers, organizers, and agitators. People from outside France also they converged around Paris. The provisional government suitably responded by removing all restrictions on the formation of political clubs and dissemination of political literature. Remember those gag measures that Louis Philippe had invoked. Obviously, with his departure, those gag orders were also revoked, and one was free to disseminate political literature. One could organize political clubs, join political clubs, do some deliberations. And just to give you a snapshot of the reality around this point of time, 170 new journals and 200 new clubs mushroomed in and around Paris within weeks, and that gives you the flavor of the times that we are talking about. Remember, as I told you, that time and again you have to keep the coordinates of nationalism, socialism and individualism as the constant reference point for whatever we are discussing. So, now you see how with the increased spread of industrial revolution, the number of industrial workers is also increasing, the idea of socialism is also gaining traction. So, alongside liberal principles or liberal regime, alongside the idea of nationalism, you also have socialist push so far as national policies of France are concerned. So, around this time you find delegations claiming to represent the oppressed of all European countries, be it the Chartists. I have earlier spoken to you about Chartists in the context of Britain, be it Hungarians, be it the Poles, they are all converging to Paris, and all this kind of situation greatly fomented a middle class alarm, because things are getting again fairly radicalized. Remember, France had seen situation during the French Revolution, which marked the entry of the revolution to its second phase during the reign of terror, during the upsurge of, you can say, sans-culottes or the Jacobin politics. So, there already was a history of this fear generated by the radicals, and the situation is becoming similar to that, and it is fomenting some kind of a middle class alarm. In fact, the Parisian radicals had pressurized the provisional government into decreeing universal male suffrage, but this proved no guarantee to their success in the April elections, which returned largely the moderate republicans and the monarchists rather than radical socialists. So, when elections happen, despite this momentum built in favor of radicalization of the movement or socialism, when elections happen, the returned candidates betray ideological slants that are either monarchist or moderate republicans and not radical socialists. So, as a result of this trend displayed by the elections, new enrollment at the national workshops obviously was stopped, because the mandate was little different and it could not sustain the kind of socialist slant that the movement was taking so far. And the enrollments, new enrollments in the national workshops were also stopped, citing the made arrangement of national workshops as some kind of a drain on finances of France. Now, you can see the middle class sensibilities in this reaction, in this stopping of the national workshop. So, a new kind of ideology, which is free market, open for profit kind of an environment, and which is against the state sponsored doles to the poor and those who have not been able to secure employment. So, you see a cross section of ideas impacting these policy measures. Workers between the age of 18 to 25 necessarily had to be sent to the armed forces. Many workers lost jobs which were state financed, and hence you find that again barricades were thrown across Paris from June 23 to 26. So, that sums up the situation that we get to see till 1848 in France with respect to the gains that liberal ideas could make alongside coming up of socialist ideas, right. So, that is it that you can understand with respect to the interplay of nationalism, liberalism and socialism till up to 1848 in France. Thank you.